David Bowie, and David will be performing another song and chatting later on in the show. Now, my next guest was the sharpest television critic of them all. Then he crossed over and for 30 years was one of the funniest and most perceptive commentators on the box. A writer on the New Yorker magazine described him as a brilliant bunch of guys. Now, he's an Australian, and to celebrate that fact, we welcome him with an appropriate musical play-on. Ladies and gentlemen, Clive James. That is our revenge on Australians. Every Australian who comes on the Parkinson show from now on will be greeted with that signature.
As long as they're also greeted with her, you know. You're gorgeous, Michael, but this is, you know, and 29, huh? And you and I are only 28.
This is true. Now, what about that rugby, though? I mean, as an Australian, are you here to apologise for the rude things that you said about our players?
First of all, the right team won. I'm very glad that England went. It was the superior team. And there would have been a real panic if Australia had won, because it would have meant the referee was on their side, because he was very tough on the English scrum. But the Australian press did say bad things about the English team. But the Australian press had spent months saying bad things about the Australian team. They'd been sledging the Australian team out of existence. The Australian press was horrified when the Australian team got as far as the final. And when they were attacking England, they were sledging. The idea is to put England off their stroke. They're trying to get England to drop the ball, which they did in the second half. They're trying to get to Johnny's foot, you see. They didn't quite...
the golden boot.
They didn't quite get there. But it's very, very fascinating the way that Johnny Wilkinson is now becoming a Beckham-style hero. If I could just trespass on this territory for a second.
Yeah.
Because David Beckham is the handsomest man in Britain. Got a wonderful kick, right? Now, here's another handsome man with a wonderful kick. And what's more, he's religious. He prays before he kicks.
And he's got funny shaped balls.
Has he? Excuse me for a second.
Sorry, I couldn't help it.
There's a lot of
These are oval balls.
There's a lot of stuff I don't know. I feel I'm about to find out.
But what's your take on this? I mean, this is obviously John is now going to be lifted into a sort of stratospheric realm, which even he can't imagine, which David Beckham and you, Victoria, know all about. But I mean, what's your take on this modern passion toward celebrity?
The pressure of celebrity is enormous. And Johnny Wilkinson is now stepping into it, and everything's going to happen to him that's been happening to David and Victoria. And it's tough. What you heard from Victoria there, it was a fascinating interview, and what you heard is she's much more human and sensitive than you would gather from the press. Well, of course, because the press is not in business to make you human and sensitive. It's in business to make you a story, an icon.
Yes.
And it's a fierce pressure. I've got a feeling the public's onto it, you know. It reached a kind of apex in the US when Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor of California. Because I don't think he became governor of California because he was the Terminator, because he made all those movies. I don't think it was just publicity that made him that. I think even the Americans who were bombarded with this stuff are capable of seeing the reality. And I think I helped. Because,
in what sense?
Well, years ago when I was a TV critic, as you mentioned, I was the first person ever to describe Arnold Schwarzenegger as a brown condom full of walnuts. I was desperately seeking for a phrase which poets and TV commentators do. And that one went off and ran. And it was being quoted while he was running for governor. And it didn't hurt him.
I mean, are journalists and poets alike in the sense that they want a line like that?
They want to say something memorable. I think that's how they get started. I think that's how we all got started. We got started in school. Australia was a very good place to start, because you started hearing poetry in the playground. I mean, the first thing I ever heard from one of my rivals in the playground was, "You're a poet and you don't know it." That was the first poem that I ever heard, because the Australian language is extremely vivid.
But did you always want to be a poet? I mean, are poets born and not made?
I think they're born, but I think it's probably psychological. I think writing poetry is a way of coming to terms with the world and making sense of confusion. I found life very confusing, and now as the end of life approaches, I find that I've been basically miserable all my life. In fact, I'm much more miserable. I'm much more miserable right now than I look. If I looked as miserable as I was, I'd frost the whole program over. You'd all be standing around on ice floes like penguins. But one of the things that helped me make sense of the confused life was doing these weird things called poems.
But why? Well, why? I mean, you've written all your life. You've written novels. You've written. You're a critic. You've written essays. Why did that not fulfil the same purpose?
It's a way of staying in childhood. It's a way of staying obsessed with language as children are. There's a beautiful couple of lines by Dylan Thomas in one of the poems he wrote towards the end of his troubled and confused life, and he was talking about being a kid and playing in the park in Swansea, and he said, "The ball I threw when playing in the park has not yet reached the ground." I think that's wonderful. That's the way he felt about his life. And when I read that, I thought, I'll never forget that, and I never have. It's one of the things that made me want to be a poet, to try and say something memorable. And I think that is really what poets do. They're trying to put it together out of this tremendous sense of everything coming apart, which I've always felt.
Now, you've written this book about it. This is why we're talking about it, called The Book of My Enemy.
Yeah.
And in it, I mean, what's interesting about the book is that, I mean, I've talked to you before about the volumes of autobiography that you've written. You've written 3 so far. And yet, they're very entertaining and wonderfully readable accounts of your life. And yet this book and a couple of poems tell me more about you than those 3 volumes. In other words, you're being more frank about yourself.
I think the emotions come out. I don't think you're ever frank about the facts, and shouldn't be, but the emotions come pouring out. An essential emotion that runs right through the life of any male, I think, any heterosexual male anyway, is sexual attraction towards various members of the opposite sex. In fact, almost all members of the opposite sex. Of any age, Victoria. And, of course, this gets progressively more embarrassing as we get older. It's not that you and I do. Incidentally, you don't.
No, I do, actually.
You're the man of our generation who has never aged. But, of course, the thing I know best about life is that sooner or later, sex will make a fool out of anybody. And one of the reasons you can write poems is that that's a way of living the problem on the page instead of on real life, or as well as in real life.
Well, when did you first? I mean, there are a couple of wonderful, funny poems in there about your attraction toward the opposite sex.
I was aware of the opposite sex from a quite early age, and
did you imagine what was required to actually seduce, fulfill your?
In fact, I still don't. I've never seduced anyone.
Have you not?
I have occasionally been seduced. I'm fairly sure that's what would happen. Yeah. But my guess is that men fall in love through the eyes, and women fall in love through the ears. That's my guess. Otherwise, there'd be no explanation for some of the men that women fall for. Now, this doesn't arise in your case because the man you're in love with happens to be the most handsome man in the world. But imagine another version of David Beckham, who was a great kicker, but it didn't look so good. Looked like me, for example. And I was quite a kicker when I was young.
But I mean, I do agree with that. I mean, do women actually, the looks are not that essential, as essential to a woman as they are to a man. Is that your observation?
I think that obviously the initial attraction, men, women, men, obviously, you've got to like what you look at, but I think personality is so much more important.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I mean, I used to fantasize about marrying a film star and that sort of thing, and I thought you had to look like a film star, and I wanted to change the way I looked. Did you ever do that?
I did until Grace. I was in love with Grace Kelly,
yes.
And I saw To Catch a Thief 4 times and walked the long way home after each viewing. And actually, I mentioned her in one of my poems. I mentioned that I was deeply and seriously in love with Grace Kelly, but it was tricky. She lived in Hollywood. She was a millionairess, and I lived in Cogra, Sydney, and I was about 12 years old.
Yeah.
But then first of all, she betrayed me by marrying Prince Rainier of Monaco. But in many ways, she saved my life. Because even I could tell that Rainier, although he had a principality, wasn't a great looker. He was short and he was fat. You will have forgotten this guy. He's actually still there. He's had a lot of trouble with his family. But it was encouraging in a way.
Yes.
I thought, if it could happen to him...
But did you never think... See, I wanted to change the way I looked. I wanted to look like Robert Mitchum. That's what I wanted to look like. And I mean, I used to sort of practice with the eyebrow, that thing. I used to tape it up at night.
You did that? That explains a lot about your eyebrow.
You've never had that?
I wanted to be James Garner, but I realised very, very gradually I would never be James Garner. No, but I was making a documentary once in Hollywood, and the top plastic surgeon in Hollywood showed me on the computer what I could look like with only a few $1 million worth of surgery. He said, you know, that weak chin of yours. And I said, what do you mean, that weak chin of mine? That what chin of mine? That weak chin of whose? He said, that weak chin of yours, we can fix it with a bit off your nose. You've got too much nose. We'll take this bit off your nose. And he sliced it off on the computer and he shifted it to my chin. And there I was, gradually turning into James Garner. And all it would have taken was a few $1 million. And I thought about it.
What about the hair, though?
Well, they built me a wig there. That was part of the documentary I was making. The guy who made the wig was called Jose. Jose said, we go make you handsome man. Jose, some kind of foreigner. And he said, this is what you need. And he built me this toupee, this toque. And it worked. It was fabulous. It just took me years off my age. But you need 4 of them. You need the one that's on, there's one in the wash, there's one for the car, and one for the pool, you know. And I imagine there's another one for when things get serious late in the evening.
Now, the book has got several examples of your love of women. Just read us a couple of examples.
It got me into trouble, actually, back in the 70s. I got very interested in women's Wimbledon.
Yes.
And probably for the wrong reason. There was
Is there a right reason?
there was a creature called Gabriella Sabatini. And I was probably tuning in for the wrong reason. Anyway, that maybe was my first mistake, but if I kept that private, no one would have cared. But then I wrote a poem about her. And it was probably a mistake to call it Bring Me the Sweat of Gabriella Sabatini. I couldn't help noticing that when this girl sweated, the sweat looked like honeydew. And I thought, well, what must that taste like? And then I made the huge error of writing a poem about it. And the feminists descended on me like hot rocks. But I'm still glad I read it. Part of the poem goes like this. If I had been Pat Cash at his great moment of triumph, I would have handed back the trophy, saying, take that thing away and don't let me see it again until it spills what makes this lawn burst into flower. Bring me the sweat of Gabriella Sabatini. And the poem goes on like that, getting me into worse and worse trouble.
And the sisters actually objected to that, did they?
Well, the sisters did, but Gabriella Sabatini, or her girl assistant, sent me a signed photograph, which I still have.
Excellent.
So she didn't mind being called beautiful. I think she would have minded if she was told she couldn't play. And Anna Kournikova is continually told she's A, beautiful, and B, she can't play. And that must really hurt.
Yes.
And now there's a new Russian girl, 16 years old, called Slapetova or something. You seen this girl? Slapetova is even more beautiful than Anna Kournikova. Very young men are interested in this. For me, I'm definitely too old for Slapetova.
Now, what else have you got there?
Well, I did a poem about Rolf Harris. Now,
yes,
not many ranking poets have written about Rolf Harris, and I was asked to contribute to a 70th birthday volume for him. And I wrote a poem, and it was built around a little-known fact about Rolf. There's something about Rolf that people don't know. He was a swimming champion when he was young. And it goes like this. When young, he was a backstroke champion. Even to fans, a fact not widely known. Backstrokers lie down, look up at the sun, and must get used to being on their own. Backstrokers squint to ward off the bright sky, and at the most they see where they have been. His future lay behind him, how he'd fly one day to great fame on a little screen. The beard, the felt tips and the wobble board, the task of tying down a kangaroo, these things the children of the world adored. Small injured animals admire him too. Kittens up trees, dogs trapped in microwaves, are grateful for his friendly nasal drawl. Tots lower hamsters into tiny graves, sure that his tender heart sustains them all. He stretched, he yawned, and woke up to world fame. He grinned, and children by the million grew to adulthood, still smiling at his name. His laugh lines hard-earned from the harsh but true sting of chlorine, the flame that bleached the blue. Well,
well, all the best with the book, and it's been good to talk to you again.
And see, I was reading poetry to Victoria Beckham right then. You see. Yes, it works at any age.
In your mind.
Yeah, in my mind.
Were you impressed, Victoria?
I was very impressed.
All right. Clive James, thank you very much indeed. Clive James.